segments and intersections. All of the roadway segments and intersections in the region to identify congestion hotspots, excluding limited access highways, which are often more expensive to address. The goal here was to move us towards a performance-based, data-driven planning framework, where we are getting the most bang for our buck by identifying locations that are the most congested and lend themselves to lower cost solutions. And I'm happy to turn it over to Casey.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having us here today. Start quickly, maybe about, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes on the presentation, be a lot quicker. Oh, there you go. Gonna start and kind of walk you through our multi-step process. I was going to start out by looking at a pretty broad region, and you kind of can't see it. There's a map kind of behind the Zoom attendees there that shows the kind of heat map of where all the congestion is. So we started with data from the entire local road network for the entire region and had to boil it down to the end. We've got 6 projects that we recommended and passed on to municipalities. So I'll walk you through there. Francis touched on this, throughout in every region around Connecticut, we hear about congestion, but I think in Fairfield County is certainly one of the more commonly identified challenges. But as the COG had mentioned, weren't necessarily seeing as many actionable lots of projects through some of these new state funding sources, so wanted to enable those to move. And our process, as I alluded to, was multi-step. We started out by identifying the most congested 75 locations out of an initial maybe about 200 or 300 that we evaluated, and then we filtered down through some coordination with your DPW directors and town engineers to identify the kind of best, most viable locations, where we had about 20. And then through continuing to coordinate and doing some additional engineering work, we identified 6 concept designs that we've advanced to essentially prepare for potential grant applications. To start out, we searched far and wide for the best kind of data source that would give us a full portrait of the local road network. Some of these communities have smaller ADTs in the 5 to 1,000 range. So trying to identify the most congested location was a challenge, whereas, downtown Stamford and downtown Newark, we had a different set of available data. Ultimately, we found that the Google congestion data, such that you get from your phone or from Waze, provided the most consistent set across the region. And essentially what we did is take screenshots at intervals that documented, so the colors essentially represent those slices, one snapshot, where the color indicates how slow people are traveling relative to normal, relative to free flow speed. And so by stacking those throughout the peak hour period, we were able to identify not just that a spot was congested at one snapshot, but throughout that kind of hour-and-a-half average peak hour period. And that enabled us to develop some metrics to Francis's point, to develop some scores for the intersection. Now, the formula, looks like something on your calculus textbook, but in reality, the natural log is only there because the congestion score is an exponential score. So basically, that comes from the Google number, how slow are people going on that segment relative to normal. The Q value was the length, how long along the roadway is it backed up. And then for the volume, we picked up the number of people that are impacted by it. And so that gave us this score, this congestion index, which we were able to calculate for over 250 locations around the region, and then use to generate an initial list. And it was a bit of a process. There was some noise in the data. We utilized several iterative meetings with our TAC, our Technical Advisory Committee, to work through some of the challenges and figure out where the data may be misleading us. But ultimately, we arrived at a list that seemed to make a lot of sense to most folks. And that led us into the next step of identifying how to potentially address congestion now that we have this list together. And that starts with, on the signal infrastructure side, many of these intersections are already signalized, and with some of the advances in recent years in terms of both detection, using video detection as opposed to loop detectors, and then in terms of the controllers themselves, namely the use of adaptive signals rather than things that rely on those inputs, previously timed phases, et cetera. So signal infrastructure was sort of an obvious point. For some intersections, whether it be a four-way stop, three-way stop, some other types of locations, we looked at full-on changing how the intersection works from a stop to a signal, stop to a roundabout, those types of things. We did look at capacity additions. But when we started the project, I'd venture to say that adding capacity wasn't really an in thing to do. It probably still really isn't. But we do see with the way the federal government's adapting their KPIs, certainly, things that improve congestion are gonna be, looked at favorably. So we are looking at, turn lanes, things of that nature. But then also a generalized bucket of things, looking at, could there be driveways closed? What's really causing the congestion? So that's where we got to dive a little bit more into the weeds of each one. And through that, we had members of your DPWs and town engineers coordinating with us. We wanted to understand where there were currently identified projects. One of the most reassuring things was actually of our top 75 list, about half of them we ruled out because there are already projects underway to address them. So that was a little bit of an encouraging step there. But mostly at this phase, we wanted to understand what are the constraints, what, big property impacts, what would addressing this congestion problem really entail, and is it feasible? And that led us into a couple lists. List A ultimately ended up being the 20 that we recommended moving further. Our list B essentially were recommended as a project, but either were smaller than the program intended. We're looking for fairly substantive projects, maybe in the $500,000 million construction cost range. So if we just identified, hey, it looks like the loop detector is broken, you should go fix that. We put that in a separate list, and that's certainly one we can make available, but it wasn't the true intent of this project. Then the other one were some bigger state-driven efforts. There's some intersections near or on Route 1 near the Greenwich Pell on I-95 as an example that we just are letting that broader project handle. And then there are just the sites that we aren't recommending to move forward, and that's either because something's already happening. So that's where those, like if there's a proposed project, that's where those sites fell. Or if frankly, there's just not a viable solution, and there are a couple places that they're congested, you can see why, there's houses built right up to it, there's really not much we can do. So we emerged from that phase with this list of 20 projects, and we wanted to identify the 6 that had the most implementable solution. And to do that, we created slides like this for each of the sites that summarized at a high level our conceptual benefit. So at this site, we were evaluating the potential addition of some additional lanes on this approach. But we went around the horn, identifying potential stakeholder or right-of-way constraints, and then putting in a high-level kind of understanding of what the potential benefits would be. And ultimately, we selected these 6 sites through that review process, which again touched back through the various either DPW directors or town and city engineers we coordinated with. And we brought each of these 6 sites forward to what we call like a concept design level, maybe 10% design. And this is an example. This is a proposed roundabout on Route 202 and Sullivan Road. But the point here is, key construction items, we needed to generate a substantive meaningful cost and the potential property impacts. And with several roundabouts, we wanted to make sure they were feasible from a space perspective. So we did, you can kind of see here, review the potential truck turning templates, some of those high-level engineering analyses. Then the second big piece of the final puzzle was summarizing the benefits. We developed a methodology to quantify the reductions in delay, despite having not the best sort of information, but we, thanks to WestCOG, they went out and collected data at each of these 6 sites that enabled us to do an estimation of the relative level of service benefits. This is an example of one of the sites where this is a conversion of a signal to a roundabout, and you do see here pretty substantive benefits, and this is one of the real positive stories to this. And so along with the potential traffic benefits, we did provide conduct standard estimates and those types of things. So we learned a lot through this about what public data sets were available, what we could use to do this type of work. It's always fun getting into these congestion studies. there often is a bit of, people have their own perception of congestion. I tend to find that everyone's congestion problem is the worst. So it's interesting to kind of compare them across different spaces and see how bad they really are. And ideally, have these projects set up for potential future funding. And I think Kevin and the team and Kristen at the COG, know a lot about these projects from the process and be happy to help them if you're interested in advancing them. I think that was it for me. Happy to take any questions.
Questions? I have one. On your roundabout, we found that if we were to put in a roundabout at the junction of 102 and Route 7, that would create a continuous flow of traffic, especially during peak traffic hours, thereby limiting access to all of the businesses in that area. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, one of the challenges with roundabouts and benefits, right, is by providing for that continuous momentum. If you have a particular movement with a dominant flow, it can just take over, and to your point, it can block people from getting out in a way that signals don't do by having their natural phases. I don't have any specific answers for you on that intersection, but it could be a viable concern, but also one that there usually are ways to work around if a roundabout really is a good solution, like typically whether it's via access management, closing some of the, consolidating some of those other access points. But yeah, probably a unique site-by-site challenge.
Anyone else? Yes, John.
I don't know if this is a question, but maybe just a statement. I worry about some pending housing legislation and generally efforts with regard to building more housing and creating more density of housing, particularly in places like Fairfield County, where we can't really expand road capacity. And there are measures like this that sort of smarten up intersections and maybe alleviate traffic at a few choke points. But I look at, by contrast, the efforts to create significantly more housing density in this area. All of those residents are going to have cars, and you're going to get to a point where that's just going to swamp all these efforts. And I really worry about those efforts to try to create denser housing kind of at all price points in these areas versus what's very limited road capacity, and it's going to significantly impact, I think, both economics and quality of life. Have you guys been involved in discussions about that, and does that kind of priority sort of loom over what you're doing? And maybe David's got comments on that as well, but it's a big concern for me and maybe others.
I'm happy to let others, this is a little bit above and beyond our project, particularly it's a great question. I'll let Francis maybe start.
Yeah, that's a really good question, John. So the purpose of this study was to help develop a pipeline of future projects for federal or state funding that can address congestion. A couple of years ago, we polled COG to see what your priorities were for spending our lots of funds. We compared it to what's actually in our program, and we saw there was not perfect alignment between what the COG's priorities are, safety and congestion, and what the funds are actually being spent on. So just trying to bring that more into alignment, ensure that the projects we choose are the ones that deliver the biggest bang for our buck in alignment with your priorities, right? And the feds have been pushing NPOs across the country to do performance-based planning. So this actually lines up with the transportation performance measures that this COG adopts every year. More or less it's a formality, but this actually helps support that. Your question is really about the linkage between transportation and land use, which even though it's there, we don't always plan in that way. And you're absolutely right. Pushing high density housing, it can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? If you have high density housing with excellent transit in a walkable area, you might have relatively low trip generation, right? We want people to be able to walk and bike, not just to reduce traffic, but also to have vibrant communities for physical activity for health. If we locate high density housing areas without sidewalk, without a mix of uses, without density, without transit, you're creating basically a traffic disaster because everybody's going to drive. And so it's absolutely critical that when we talk about transit-oriented development, it's real transit-oriented development and not something else being rebranded as that. It's not part of this project. It is something the COG works on. It's something that we've been striving to communicate to our legislators who are absolutely interested in a more diversity of housing choices. I don't think they fully understand the relationship between where you site housing and how many cars you end up with on the roads. Still a work in progress.
And so obviously you went through and you prioritized
all these different project possibilities you mentioned, that some of them were taking off the shelf because towns were already working on it. So I guess, I don't know, my question is for you, if my question is for COG, maybe. What happens, like, we have things that we're working on, like through a Safe Streets for All grant, and try to do that planning. Is this somehow gonna take priority in COG's, efforts to prioritize, like, we have this issue on Stony Hill Road, which you're aware of, right, the congestion, the traffic, and we're gonna approach that through a Safe Streets for All grant. Will that somehow be put into this priority, or are these gonna be what we look at going forward?
This is for congestion mitigation.
Yeah. Congestion on Route 6 is.
Yeah,
part of
this
the
this is for congestion
Yeah.
mitigation, so obviously we also have a regional transportation safety plan and there are
Yeah.
local plans, and how that all shakes out is up to you, COG, we're
Okay.
just the staff, you're the decision.
No, I
makers.
understand, I'm just curious how they're gonna prioritize these from the.
Well, we have to,
Yeah, I see.
I mean, we prioritize mix of projects, some are congestion, some are access, some are
Yeah.
safety.
This one is congestion leading to safety.
Right.
It's coming over a hill and it's all congested and somebody's gonna get. Yeah, we need to
And
make sure
project,
everybody-
and project readiness, right, we could have, I mean,
Right.
these are all feasible projects,
Yeah,
but things can pop up or something speeds up or slows down.
fair enough.
But I think to John's point, with future projections of population, if there's housing needs to be built, the impact, I think we all, if we don't have traffic problems today, you're unique.
Yeah.
And going forward, it's just gonna get worse wherever your congestion areas are. And I think that's John's point. So if we were to plug in those projections of the mandates and certain housing numbers that we're gonna have to meet, what would that do to those intersection points of congestion today? And why aren't we looking at the future rather than looking at today? Don?
I just sort of want to reiterate what you saying in agreement with your very good point here. And it doesn't sound like housing is being taken into account by either our lawmakers and planners here. And, you know, I think somebody needs to voice that this is really an important part of the synergy between what we're planning with housing and our transportation. It's almost moved unless you consider the two. It was an excellent point.
And to Dan's point too, about
Yeah.
Stony Hill, Route 6, just gonna get worse.
Mhm.
So how do we address that?
Well, we did account for future volumes, just to be clear, we did, when we analyzed congestion, we did grow traffic to 2050 using 0.5% per year annual growth, which is frankly far in excess of what the state's experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. So, and just on your other anecdotal point, in all the travel demand modeling work I've done, we have a history of overestimating growth and overestimating population growth. Most of our traffic models, if anything, are leaning on the other side of that. And recently we've had tough conversations with the DOT where they have the mandate to reduce VMT, yet have a state projection of a certain housing growth that never the two will meet. So like, yeah, this is a good fundamental question. Sorry, I'll stop thinking.
Okay,
I can say from a planning perspective, at the COG level, we do seek to integrate our regional plan of conservation development with the regional transportation plan. I'm sure you do at the local level too. And the executive branch, the Office of Policy Management, CONDOT, and quasi such as David's, also, I think, live and breathe this linkage. Sometimes things get lost in translation and going up to the legislature.
anyone else? Thank you very much, appreciate it. Is there a follow-up on it?
So, no, this study essentially is concluding, where we stand with it is we have two things. One is we have 6 concept designs that could be submitted into a funding program to move along, right? But we don't want this just to be a single glob moving down the conveyor belt, the project development pipeline, right? We want to make sure that we're constantly ask for something, you can receive something, right? And historically, this region has had challenges in fully utilizing its lots of allocation. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore, but it's always good to have projects waiting in the wings. So our goal here is to work with our members to ensure we constantly have a full set of projects, whether it's addressing congestion, safety, economic development, or other needs. So I anticipate more projects like this happening in the future.
Move on. Mike, you're up now.